On December 29, 1989, the Japanese stock market hit an all-time high, and Tokyo real estate reached valuations that broke basic mathematics. At the peak of the bubble, this exact patch of land, the Imperial Palace grounds in central Tokyo, was theoretically worth more than every piece of real estate in the entire state of California combined. To understand how staggering that wealth was, we have to look at where the country started just 40 years prior. In 1945, Japan's economy was at absolute zero. Major cities were reduced to ash, industrial capacity was shattered, and millions faced starvation. The engine that drove them out of the rubble was a uniquely Japanese corporate structure called the keiretsu. Instead of companies fighting for quarterly profits, household savings flowed into a few massive banks, which then fed cheap credit into a web of interlinked corporations. These companies protected each other from outside competition, allowing them to offer lifetime employment to their workers and focus entirely on long-term market dominance. Protected at home and heavily funded by those banks, Japanese manufacturers turned outward. By the mid-1980s, they had conquered global markets in steel, shipbuilding, consumer electronics, and automobiles, running up the largest trade surplus with the United States in history. Japan's long stagnation was not caused by a sudden rise in corruption or a workforce that lost its edge. Throughout its decades of slow growth, the country remained one of the most educated, safe, and technologically sophisticated societies on Earth. The problem was the structure of the miracle itself. The same interlocked banking networks, cultural loyalties, and ministry-led industrial policies that fueled the 20th century recovery became rigid barriers to adaptation. When the global economy shifted toward digital agility, the systems Japan built for industrial dominance became a trap. The unraveling began with a currency dispute. By 1985, American policymakers were panicking over job losses to cheaper Japanese imports. To fix this, the U.S. and its allies pushed through the Plaza Accord, an agreement that forced the Japanese yen to rapidly double in value against the dollar. Overnight, Toyota cars and Sony electronics became drastically more expensive for foreign buyers, threatening Japan's entire export-dependent model. Panicked by the threat of an export collapse, the Bank of Japan slashed interest rates to historic lows. They wanted to encourage domestic spending to make up for lost foreign sales. Instead, businesses and households took that incredibly cheap borrowed money and poured it into speculation. They bought stocks, golf course memberships, and Tokyo real estate. The rising value of that land was then used as collateral to borrow even more money, creating a massive self-referential bubble. Realizing asset prices had detached from reality, the central bank finally raised interest rates in 1989. The effect was immediate. The circular logic of borrowing against rising assets ran in reverse. Everyone tried to sell at once. The stock market collapsed, real estate values plummeted by up to 90% over the next decade, and $10 trillion in national wealth simply evaporated. This chart explains the mechanics of the deflation trap. When prices start falling across an economy, consumers realize that if they just wait 6 months to buy a refrigerator or a car, it will cost less. Because everyone is waiting, businesses sell less. To survive, those businesses cut wages. Now the consumer has less money, which forces prices down even further, making waiting an even better strategy. This loop makes perfect logical sense for every single individual. But when 125 million people make that rational choice at the exact same time, it freezes the entire national economy in place. In a normal market, this kind of crisis forces failing businesses into bankruptcy, clearing the way for new growth. But Japan's banks and keiretsu networks refuse to let their loyal partners die. Instead of admitting their massive losses, banks endlessly rolled over bad loans, keeping thousands of insolvent zombie companies alive on life support. The loyalty and stability that built Japan Inc. prevented the creative destruction required to heal. Capital was trapped inside dying corporations, starving any new, innovative businesses of the credit they needed to grow. As capital froze, Japan's manufacturing philosophy hit its own wall. The culture of Kaizen, continuous, incremental improvement, was brilliant for perfecting physical hardware like the Walkman, but it was entirely misaligned with the chaotic, disruptive leap into the software and internet revolution of the 1990s. The country that invented consumer electronics largely watched the digital age pass it by. At the same time, the corporate culture was squandering its human resources. This chart tracks the M curve, a phenomenon where highly educated Japanese women participated in the workforce in their 20s, but were systematically pushed out by inflexible corporate expectations once they married or had children, only returning years later in low-wage part-time roles. Economists estimate this specific structural failure cost Japan up to 15% of its potential GDP. By forcing women to choose between a career and a family, the nation actively excluded half of its top human capital from leadership positions. When the economy shrank, the famous promise of lifetime employment meant major corporations couldn't fire their older permanent staff. To cut costs, they simply stopped hiring. An entire generation of young people entered the job market in the 1990s and found the doors locked, forcing them into insecure, temporary gig economy contracts with low pay and zero career progression. This economic insecurity triggered an existential crisis. Traditional social norms expected men to be primary breadwinners, but a temporary worker couldn't offer that stability. Women, tired of the rigid patriarchal trade-offs, increasingly opted out of marriage entirely. As marriage rates collapsed, birth rates followed. Today, Japan's working-age population is plummeting, forcing a shrinking tax base to support a massive, growing elderly population. What started as a burst financial bubble was absorbed entirely by the youth. The refusal to modernize cultural expectations and labor laws mutated a temporary banking crisis into an irreversible demographic time bomb. In 2012, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe launched a desperate rescue operation known as Abenomics. It was a massive three-pronged strategy aiming to shock the economy awake through aggressive central bank money printing, heavy government spending, and deep structural reforms to corporate governance and labor laws. Over a decade later, the results are decidedly mixed. In early 2024, the stock market finally broke its 1989 record, and wage growth has begun to appear. But the Japanese yen has sunk to multi-decade lows against the dollar, and the core demographic rot has only accelerated, with birth rates continuing to hit record lows. Japan's long stagnation leaves behind two urgent lessons. First, massive asset bubbles are often the toxic byproduct of a successful economy taking its own stability for granted. And when that bubble bursts, clearing the rot out of the banking system is not optional. It is the absolute prerequisite for any future growth. Second, structural reform is significantly harder to implement than monetary stimulus. Reforming labor laws, opening the country to immigration, and fixing the gender gap requires confronting powerful vested interests. However, a shrinking, aging workforce creates a mathematical ceiling on growth that no amount of debt-funded spending can overcome. For countries currently experiencing their own explosive growth, places like India or the rapidly industrializing nations of Southeast Asia, Japan is holding up a mirror to the future. It proves that a highly educated, technologically advanced, and safe society can still stall out for decades. The ultimate test of a nation's economy is not how fast it can grow during the good years. It is whether its institutions and its people are flexible enough to dismantle the exact structures that made them successful the moment the era demands it. On